The courthouse steps felt cold beneath my feet as I clutched the manila envelope containing everything I had left to prove my case. 3 months of fighting, 3 months of sleepless nights, and it all came down to this moment. My uncle Eric Cooper stood 20 feet away, his expensive suit making him look every inch the successful businessman he claimed to be. But I knew the truth now. I knew what he had done. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse opened behind me, and my lawyer, Frances Williams, emerged, her face grim. She had warned me this wouldn't be easy. Proving forgery after 18 years, especially when the forged documents had been filed so carefully, so professionally, was nearly impossible. But I had something Eric didn't expect me to have. I had grandmother's real will, the one she had hidden in the old cedar chest, the one that clearly stated the ranch belonged to me. My hands trembled as I remembered finding that document just weeks ago, tucked beneath layers of quilts and memories. The ink had faded, but the words were clear. Sandra Young, my beloved granddaughter, inherits all property and assets upon reaching 18 years of age. Not Eric Cooper, her son, not anyone else. Me. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story really begins 6 months earlier, on my 18th birthday, in the cramped office of Riverside County Children's Services. I had been counting down the days until I could age out of the system, finally free from the endless cycle of foster homes and group facilities that had defined my entire life. I thought I knew everything about my past. I thought I was completely alone in the world. That morning, caseworker Cynthia Hill called me into her office with an expression I had never seen before. Usually our meetings were routine check-ins, discussions about my job at the local diner, or preparations for independent living. But this time she held a thick envelope with official-looking letterhead. "Your grandmother left you something," she said, sliding the envelope across her desk. I stared at it like it might bite me. I had no grandmother. I had no family at all. My parents had died in a car accident when I was 3, and I had been in the system ever since. No relatives had ever come forward. No family had ever claimed me. The letter was from a law firm in a small town called Cedar Falls, 300 miles north. It explained that Sandra Young, my paternal grandmother, had passed away 2 months earlier. According to their records, I was her sole surviving heir, and she had left me her ranch property. The lawyers needed me to come sign paperwork and claim my inheritance. I read the letter 3 times before the words sank in. A grandmother I never knew existed, a ranch I had never seen, a family history that had been completely hidden from me for 15 years. That night, I lay in my narrow bed at the group home, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what this meant. I had spent my entire conscious life believing I was alone, that no one in the world cared whether I lived or died. The knowledge that there had been someone out there, someone who knew I existed and cared enough to leave me something, felt like discovering I could breathe underwater. The bus ride to Cedar Falls took 7 hours through rolling hills and farmland I had never seen before. I pressed my face to the window, watching the landscape change from suburban sprawl to genuine countryside. Fields of corn stretched to the horizon, broken by farmhouses and red barns that looked like something from a postcard. Cedar Falls turned out to be exactly the kind of small town I had only seen in movies. Main Street had a hardware store, a diner called Rosie's, and a feed store with old men sitting on the porch. Everyone seemed to know everyone else, waving and calling out greetings as they passed. I felt like an alien visitor, carrying my single duffel bag and wearing clothes from the donation pile at the group home. The law office of Brandon Edwards and Associates occupied a converted Victorian house on Elm Street. Brandon Edwards himself was younger than I expected, probably in his 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He welcomed me warmly and offered coffee, which I accepted gratefully. "I have to tell you," he said, settling behind his desk, "your grandmother talked about you constantly. She was so proud of you, even though circumstances kept her from being part of your life." Circumstances. That was a careful way of putting it, and I pressed him for details. What I learned broke my heart and filled me with rage in equal measure. Sandra Young had tried to gain custody of me after my parents died. She had petitioned the court, hired lawyers, and fought for 2 years to bring me to live with her. But my father's brother, Eric Cooper, had contested her petition. He claimed she was too old, too poor, and too unstable to care for a child. He presented evidence of her financial struggles and her age-related health issues. He convinced the court that I would be better served by the foster system until a suitable adoptive family could be found. The suitable family never materialized, and Eric Cooper disappeared from the legal proceedings entirely. For 15 years, I bounced between homes while my grandmother lived alone on her ranch, sending letters and gifts that were returned by the state, making inquiries that were blocked by privacy laws. She never stopped trying to find a way to reach you, Brandon said. When she got sick last year, the first thing she did was update her will to make sure you would inherit everything. She wanted to give you the home and stability she was never allowed to provide while she was alive. He handed me a thick folder containing property deeds, financial statements, and legal documents. The ranch was 200 acres of prime farmland, including a main house built in 1920, a large barn, and several outbuildings. There were also mineral rights, water rights, and a small but steady income from leasing some acreage to neighboring farmers. But there was a problem. Brandon's expression grew troubled as he explained that Eric Cooper had surfaced again after Sandra's death. He was contesting the will, claiming that his mother had been mentally incompetent when she wrote it. He had produced his own documentation showing that Sandra had intended to leave the property to him, her son, rather than to a granddaughter she had never met. The case was complicated by the fact that Eric's documents appeared to be legitimate. They were properly notarized, filed with the county, and dated several months before Sandra's death. Without clear evidence of fraud or forgery, the probate court was inclined to honor what appeared to be her most recent wishes. I felt the bottom drop out of my world. For a few brief hours, I had believed that I finally had a family, a home, a place where I belonged. Now it was being taken away by the same man who had kept me from my grandmother in the first place. But Brandon wasn't giving up, and neither was I. He arranged for me to stay at a local bed and breakfast while we gathered evidence and prepared for the legal battle ahead. The owner, Christina Ruiz, was a woman in her 50s who had known Sandra Young for decades. She welcomed me like family, insisting I call her Aunt Christina and refusing to accept payment for my room. That first night, she sat with me on the front porch of her Victorian house, sharing stories about my grandmother. Sandra had been a pillar of the community, she explained. She had run the ranch single-handedly after her husband died, raised prize-winning cattle, and helped dozens of neighbors through hard times. Everyone in Cedar Falls had loved and respected her. She talked about you all the time, Christina said, rocking gently in her wooden chair. She had pictures of you from when you were little, before the state cut off contact. She kept them on her mantle and showed them to anyone who would listen. She was so proud that you were doing Carol in school, getting good grades despite everything you had been through. How did she know about my grades? I asked, confused. Christina smiled sadly. She hired a private investigator to keep track of you. She couldn't contact you directly, but she needed to know you were safe and healthy. Every year on your birthday, she would get a report about how you were doing. She knew about your job at the diner, your plans to study business, your dream of owning your own restaurant someday. The knowledge that someone had been watching over me, caring about my progress and rooting for my success, was overwhelming. I had spent so many nights feeling completely alone in the world, never knowing that 300 miles away, an old woman was thinking about me and worrying about my future. The next morning, Christina drove me out to see the ranch for the first time. We followed a winding country road for about 10 miles, passing fields of soybeans and pastures dotted with cattle. Finally, we turned through a gate marked with a weathered wooden sign that read Young Ranch, established 1918. The main house sat on a small rise surrounded by mature oak trees and a white picket fence that had seen better days. It was a two-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and green shutters, exactly the kind of home I had dreamed about during my loneliest nights in foster care. Behind it stood a massive red barn and several smaller buildings, all showing signs of age but still structurally sound. Christina parked in the gravel driveway, and we sat for a moment in silence. The property had been empty for 2 months, and there was a stillness about it that felt both peaceful and sad. She loved this place more than anything, Christina said softly. Your grandfather built most of these buildings with his own hands. They raised your father here, and she always hoped she would get to raise you here too. We walked through the house room by room, and I felt like I was stepping into a museum of the life I should have had. The kitchen had vintage appliances and a large farmhouse table scarred by decades of use. The living room was filled with comfortable furniture and family photographs, including several pictures of a little boy I realized must be my father. But it was the master bedroom that truly broke my heart. On the dresser sat a collection of school photos, starting with my kindergarten picture and continuing through my senior year. Somehow, my grandmother had obtained copies of every single school photo I had ever taken. Next to them was a small wooden box filled with letters, all addressed to me but never sent. I opened one with trembling hands and read words that brought tears to my eyes. "My dearest granddaughter," it began, "I hope this letter finds you happy and healthy. I think about you every day and pray that you know how much you are loved. I wish I could be there to help you with your homework, to braid your hair, to tell you stories about your father when he was your age." There were dozens of letters, one for every birthday, every Christmas, every major milestone she had missed. Reading them was like discovering a parallel universe where I had grown up surrounded by love instead of shuffling between strangers. But our exploration was interrupted by the sound of a truck pulling into the driveway. Through the bedroom window, I watched a man in an expensive suit climb out of a black pickup truck. Even from a distance, I could see the family resemblance. This had to be Eric Cooper. Christina and I went downstairs to meet him, and the tension was immediate. Eric was a man in his 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of confident bearing that came from always getting his way. He looked at me with undisguised hostility. "So you're the granddaughter," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I suppose you think you can just waltz in here and claim what doesn't belong to you." I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I intended. "According to the will, this property does belong to me." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "According to the real will, the one my mother signed when she was thinking clearly, this property belongs to me. You're nothing but a stranger who happened to share some DNA with her. I'm her son. I'm the one who should inherit what she built." Christina stepped forward, her voice sharp with anger. "Eric Cooper, you should be ashamed of yourself. Sandra spent 15 years trying to bring that girl home, and you're the one who prevented it. Now you want to steal her inheritance too." "I'm not stealing anything," he replied coldly. "I'm protecting what's rightfully mine. This girl has no idea how to run a ranch. She'll probably sell it to developers within a year and destroy everything my mother worked for." He turned back to me, his eyes cold and calculating. "I'll make you a deal. I'll give you $50,000 to walk away right now. That's more money than you've ever seen, and it's a lot more than you'll get after I tie this up in court for the next 5 years. The offer was tempting, I had to admit. $50,000 would pay for college, help me start the restaurant I dreamed of owning, give me a foundation for building a life. But looking around at the house my grandmother had filled with love, at the land she had worked and cherished, I knew I couldn't take his money. "This ranch isn't for sale," I said, surprised by the strength of my own voice. "And neither am I." Eric's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, girl. I have lawyers, I have money, and I have documentation that proves this property belongs to me. You have nothing but a piece of paper and some sentimental nonsense about a grandmother you never met." After he left, Christina and I spent the rest of the day exploring the ranch and planning our strategy. She introduced me to the neighbors, including Timothy Ruiz, who farmed the adjacent property, and his son Joshua, who helped manage Sandra's cattle lease agreements. They were both outraged by Eric's claims and eager to help in any way they could. That evening, we met with Brandon Edwards to discuss our legal options. The situation was complicated, he explained, because Eric's documentation appeared legitimate on the surface. The signatures looked authentic, the notarization was proper, and the dates were consistent with his story about Sandra changing her mind about the inheritance. But Brandon had noticed some inconsistencies that gave him hope. The paper used for Eric's documents was slightly different from the paper Sandra typically used for legal matters. The ink appeared to be from a different type of pen than she normally used. Most importantly, the handwriting, while close, didn't quite match samples of Sandra's signature from the same time period. "We need a handwriting expert," he said, "but that's going to be expensive. We also need to prove that Eric had access to Sandra's personal documents and the opportunity to forge her signature. Do you know if he visited her in the months before she died?" Christina nodded grimly. "He showed up about 6 months ago, claiming he wanted to reconcile with his mother before it was too late. Sandra was so happy to see him, she let him stay in the guest room for 2 weeks. He had access to everything, her personal papers, her checkbook, even her will. That visit had been Eric's opportunity to study Sandra's handwriting, to practice forging her signature, and to create the documents he would need to steal my inheritance. The realization that he had manipulated a dying woman's hope for reconciliation made me sick to my stomach. The next few weeks were a blur of legal preparations and emotional discoveries. I moved into the ranch house, despite Brandon's concerns about how it might look to the judge. I couldn't bear to stay away from the place that should have been my childhood home. And I wanted to understand what my grandmother had built. The house was full of treasures that told the story of the Young family. I found photo albums documenting 4 generations of life on the ranch, from my great-grandfather who had first purchased the land, to my grandfather who had expanded the operation, to my grandmother who had kept it running after she was widowed. There were pictures of my father as a baby, as a toddler learning to ride, as a teenager showing cattle at the county fair. But the most important discovery came when I was cleaning out the master bedroom closet. Hidden behind winter coats and old blankets was a cedar chest I hadn't noticed before. Inside, beneath layers of quilts and linens, I found a manila envelope marked "Important Documents." The envelope contained the original copy of Sandra's will, the real one, dated just 3 months before her death. It was written entirely in her handwriting, with no fancy legal language or professional formatting. It simply stated that she, Sandra Young, being of sound mind and body, left all her property and assets to her beloved granddaughter, with the hope that I would find happiness in belonging in the place that had been home to our family for 4 generations. But even more damning was what else I found in that envelope. There were practice sheets where someone had been copying Sandra's signature over and over, trying to perfect the forgery. There were drafts of the fake will, with corrections and revisions in Eric's handwriting. Most importantly, there was a letter Eric had written to his mother, never sent, revealing his true feelings about her and his plans for the ranch. In the letter, he called Sandra a stubborn old woman who was wasting valuable property on cattle and crops, when she could be making millions by selling to developers. He wrote about his debts, his failed businesses, and his desperate need for money. He outlined his plan to convince her to change her will, and if that didn't work, to create documentation that would give him control of the property after her death. The letter was dated just 2 weeks into his visit, proof that he had come to Cedar Falls not to reconcile with his mother, but to steal her legacy. Armed with this evidence, Brandon filed a motion to have Eric's documents examined by a forensic handwriting expert. The expert, Dr. Kimberly Jimenez, was a retired FBI analyst who specialized in document fraud. Her initial examination confirmed our suspicions. The signatures on Eric's documents were skillful forgeries, but they lacked the natural flow and pressure variations of genuine handwriting. Eric fought back with his own experts and expensive lawyers, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The practice sheets, the draft documents, and the incriminating letter painted a clear picture of premeditated fraud. The judge was not impressed by Eric's claims of innocence, especially when Dr. Jimenez demonstrated exactly how the forgeries had been created. The legal battle stretched on for 3 months, during which I lived in a strange limbo between hope and despair. Some days I felt confident that justice would prevail, that the truth about Eric's fraud would be recognized by the court. Other days I was consumed by doubt, terrified that his money and connections would somehow allow him to steal what rightfully belonged to me. During this time, I threw myself into learning about ranch management and agricultural practices. Timothy Ruiz became an unofficial mentor, teaching me about crop rotation, cattle management, and the business side of farming. His son Joshua, who was about my age, showed me how to operate the machinery and maintain the buildings. The work was physically demanding, but emotionally healing. There was something deeply satisfying about caring for the land my grandmother had loved, about continuing the legacy she had been forced to build alone. Every morning I woke up in the house where my father had been raised, surrounded by the history and traditions I should have inherited from birth. The community of Cedar Falls embraced me in ways I had never experienced. Christina Ruiz continued to treat me like family, inviting me for Sunday dinners and including me in town events. The neighbors brought casseroles and offered help with repairs and maintenance. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to belong somewhere. But Eric's legal challenges cast a shadow over everything. He had filed multiple motions trying to delay the proceedings, hoping to exhaust my financial resources and force me to accept a settlement. He spread rumors around town about my motives, claiming I was an opportunistic stranger who planned to sell the ranch to developers. The stress was overwhelming at times. I had nightmares about losing the ranch, about being forced back into the system of temporary homes and temporary relationships that had defined my childhood. Some mornings I woke up convinced that this was all a dream, that I would open my eyes to find myself back in the group home with nothing but disappointment ahead. But I also found strength I didn't know I possessed. The knowledge that my grandmother had fought for me, that she had never stopped believing in me or hoping for my future, gave me the courage to keep fighting. I wasn't just defending my inheritance, I was honoring her memory and claiming the life she had wanted me to have. The turning point came when Brandon discovered that Eric had made a crucial mistake. In his eagerness to create convincing forgeries, he had used Sandra's actual notary, a woman named Frances Williams, who had handled Sandra's legal documents for 20 years. But Frances had been out of town on the date Eric claimed she had notarized his fake will. Frances was horrified to learn that her notary seal had been forged, and she provided detailed testimony about Sandra's actual final visit to her office. Sandra had come alone, Frances testified, specifically to ensure that her will clearly stated her intentions regarding her granddaughter. She had been completely lucid and adamant that Eric should receive nothing from her estate. The forged notarization was the final nail in Eric's coffin. Forgery was bad enough, but forging a notary seal was a federal crime that carried serious penalties. Faced with the prospect of criminal charges in addition to losing the civil case, Eric's lawyers began pushing him toward a settlement. But I wasn't interested in settling. This wasn't about money or property anymore. It was about justice and truth. Eric had stolen 15 years of my relationship with my grandmother, and now he was trying to steal her final gift to me. I wanted him held accountable for what he had done. The final hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in late September. I had been living on the ranch for 4 months by then, long enough to feel truly at home for the first time in my life. The night before the hearing, I walked through the house and around the property, touching the things my grandmother had touched, imagining the conversations we might have had if Eric hadn't interfered with our lives. That brings me back to where I started, standing on those courthouse steps with my future hanging in the balance. Frances Williams emerged from the building with news that the judge had not only ruled in my favor, but had also ordered Eric to pay my legal fees and face criminal charges for document fraud and forgery. Eric Cooper's face was white with shock and rage as the bailiff read the judgment. He had gambled everything on his ability to manipulate the legal system, just as he had manipulated it 18 years earlier to keep me from my grandmother. This time, his lies and forgeries had been exposed. As we left the courthouse, Eric made one final attempt to intimidate me. He cornered me in the parking lot, his face twisted with hatred. "You think you've won," he snarled, "but you have no idea what you're getting into. Running a ranch isn't some fairy tale. You'll fail within a year, and when you do, I'll be waiting to buy the property for pennies on the dollar." I looked at this man who had caused so much pain and destruction, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, but pity. He had spent his entire adult life consumed by greed and resentment, alienating everyone who might have loved him, destroying relationships for the sake of money he didn't even need. "You're wrong about one thing," I told him calmly. "I'm not going to fail because I'm not doing this alone, yo. I have something you never understood, something my grandmother tried to teach you, but you were too selfish to learn. I have community. I have people who care about me and want to see me succeed. That's worth more than all the money you could steal." The criminal trial took place 6 months later. Eric was convicted on multiple charges of fraud and forgery and sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. The judge made it clear that his manipulation of an elderly woman's trust and his attempt to defraud her heir were particularly heinous crimes that deserved serious punishment. But by then, I was too busy building my new life to spend much time thinking about Eric's downfall. The ranch had become everything I had dreamed it could be. With Timothy's guidance and Joshua's help, I had learned to manage the cattle operation and had even expanded into organic vegetables that I sold at the local farmers market. More importantly, I had found the sense of belonging I had searched for my entire life. Cedar Falls wasn't just the town where I lived, it was home in the truest sense of the word. The people there had become my chosen family, filling the void that had existed since my parents' death. Christina Ruiz had become the aunt I never had, always ready with advice or a home-cooked meal when I needed comfort. Timothy and Joshua were like the grandfather and brother I had missed growing up, teaching me not just about farming, but about what it meant to be part of a community that looked out for each other. I also discovered talents and interests I never knew I possessed. Working with my hands, caring for animals, growing food from the earth, all of it felt natural and fulfilling in ways that surprised me. The restaurant I had once dreamed of owning seemed less important than the life I was building on the land my grandmother had preserved for me. But perhaps the most healing discovery was the correspondence I found between Sandra and various people in town. She had quietly helped dozens of families over the years, lending money during hard times, providing jobs for struggling workers, donating food and supplies to anyone in need. Her generosity had been legendary, and people still spoke of her kindness with genuine affection. Learning about her character helped me understand not just where I came from, but who I wanted to become. The ranch wasn't just property I had inherited, it was a legacy of service and community involvement that I was determined to continue. I established a scholarship fund in Sandra's name to help other young people aging out of the foster system. I opened the ranch for community events and fundraisers. I hired local teenagers to help with farm work, giving them the kind of meaningful employment and mentorship I had missed growing up. The work was challenging, and there were plenty of difficult days when equipment broke down or weather threatened the crops. But even the hardest days on the ranch were better than the best days I had experienced in the system. I was building something lasting, something that mattered, something that honored the woman who had loved me from a distance for so many years. 2 years after the legal battle ended, I received an unexpected visitor. Anthony Gutierrez was a private investigator from the city, the same man Sandra had hired to keep track of me during my childhood. He was nearing retirement and wanted to meet the young woman he had watched grow up through school records and caseworker reports. I invited him to stay for dinner, and we spent the evening looking through the files he had compiled over the years. It was strange and moving to see my life documented from an outside perspective, to understand how closely Sandra had followed my progress even when she couldn't be part of it. "She was so proud of you," Anthony said, flipping through photos and report cards. "Every year when I delivered my update, she would cry with happiness over your achievements and worry about your struggles. She kept every school photo, every report card, every newspaper clipping that mentioned your name. You were the center of her world, even though she couldn't tell you that directly." He also revealed something that explained a mystery I had wondered about for years. Several of my foster families had received anonymous donations that helped them provide better care for me. A bicycle for my 10th birthday, money for school clothes, funds for a class trip I thought I couldn't afford. All of it had come from Sandra, channeled through Anthony to avoid legal complications. "She wanted to make your life easier in whatever small ways she could," he explained. "She couldn't be your grandmother in person, but she tried to be your guardian angel from a distance." The knowledge that I had been loved and protected all along, even during my loneliest moments, was overwhelming. I had spent so many years believing I was completely alone, never knowing that someone was watching over me and rooting for my success. That conversation with Anthony helped me understand something important about forgiveness and healing. I realized that while Eric had stolen years of relationship between Sandra and me, he couldn't steal the love that had existed between us. That love had transcended distance and legal barriers, expressing itself in ways I was only beginning to understand. I also began to see my years in the system differently. Instead of viewing them as lost time or wasted opportunities, I started to appreciate the resilience and independence they had taught me. The skills I had developed navigating foster care, managing disappointment, and building relationships with strangers were serving me well as I built my new life. The ranch continued to thrive under my management. I had discovered a talent for the business side of farming, developing marketing strategies that increased our profits in building relationships with restaurants and stores that wanted locally sourced products. The property that Eric had seen only as potential development land was actually more valuable as a working farm than it would have been as subdivided lots. But the real measure of my success wasn't financial. It was the sense of purpose and belonging I felt every morning when I walked out to check on the cattle, every evening when I sat on the porch my grandfather had built, every time a neighbor stopped by to chat or ask for advice. I had become part of the fabric of Cedar Falls in ways that went beyond simply owning property there. I served on the school board, volunteered at the library, and helped organize the annual Harvest Festival. The community that had welcomed me as Sandra's granddaughter had come to accept me as myself, valued for my contributions rather than my inheritance. 3 years after moving to the ranch, I met someone who would become an important part of my future. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was a veterinarian who had recently moved to Cedar Falls to take over the practice of the retiring local vet. She was smart, kind, and shared my love of rural life and agricultural traditions. Our friendship developed slowly over shared meals and long conversations about everything from cattle breeding to community development. Sarah had grown up on a farm in another state and understood both the challenges and rewards of agricultural life. She appreciated the history and legacy represented by the young ranch, and she supported my efforts to honor Sandra's memory through community service. What started as friendship gradually became something deeper. Sarah was the first person I had ever met who truly understood my journey from abandonment to belonging, who appreciated both my strength and my vulnerability. She had her own story of overcoming obstacles and building a meaningful career, and we found in each other the kind of partnership that enhanced both our individual dreams. But even as my personal life flourished, I never forgot the broader purpose Sandra had intended for the ranch. The scholarship fund I had established was helping 3 young people each year transition out of foster care with financial support for education and job training. The ranch itself had become a kind of informal training ground where teenagers could learn work skills and gain confidence through meaningful employment. I also began working with state agencies to improve the foster care system that had shaped my own childhood. My story had attracted media attention, and I used that platform to advocate for better support for aging out youth and stronger efforts to maintain family connections when possible. The irony wasn't lost on me that Eric's greed and manipulation had actually led to positive changes that might help other young people avoid some of the loneliness and uncertainty I had experienced. His attempts to steal my inheritance had brought attention to the gaps in the system and the importance of family preservation. 4 years after the legal battle ended, I received word that Eric was being released from prison. I had mixed feelings about his return to freedom, but I wasn't afraid of him anymore. The ranch was legally and unquestionably mine. The community stood firmly behind me, and I had built a life that was too strong to be threatened by his bitterness. He never contacted me directly after his release, but I heard through the local gossip network that he had moved to another state and was working in construction. I hoped he had learned something from his time in prison, that he might find a way to build a legitimate life instead of trying to steal what others had earned. The truth was, I rarely thought about Eric anymore. The anger and resentment that had consumed me during the legal battle had been replaced by gratitude and purpose. I was too busy living the life Sandra had wanted me to have to waste energy on the man who had tried to prevent it. 5 years after inheriting the ranch, I stood in the same master bedroom where I had first discovered Sandra's hidden will. But now I was preparing for my wedding to Sarah. The room had been redecorated with fresh paint and new furniture, but I had kept Sandra's photos and personal items as reminders of the love that had made this day possible. Christina Ruiz bustled around me, adjusting my dress and fussing with my hair like the mother I had never had. Timothy would walk me down the aisle, and Joshua would serve as one of my groomsmen alongside Sarah's brother. The wedding party was a mixture of biological and chosen family, representing the community that had embraced me and the future I was building. The ceremony took place in the front yard of the ranch, under the oak trees Sandra had planted decades earlier. Guests filled folding chairs borrowed from the church, and the reception would be held in the barn that had been decorated with flowers from the garden I had planted my first spring on the ranch. As I walked down the aisle towards Sarah, I thought about all the moments that had led to this one. The frightened 18-year-old who had first learned about her inheritance could never have imagined this scene. The scared girl who had fought for her rights in court couldn't have pictured herself surrounded by so much love and support. But Sandra could have imagined it. In her letters, she had written about her hopes for my future, her dreams of seeing me settled and happy on the land she had preserved. She had envisioned family gatherings in the house she had maintained, celebrations in the barn she had kept in good repair, a continuation of the traditions she had carried alone for so many years. The wedding was everything I had dreamed of and more. The entire town seemed to be there, celebrating not just my marriage, but the community connections that had made it possible. People told stories about Sandra, shared memories of the ranch's history, and welcomed Sarah as the newest member of our extended family. During the reception, Timothy stood up to make a toast that brought tears to my eyes. He spoke about the girl who had arrived in Cedar Falls with nothing but a legal claim and a broken heart, and how she had grown into a woman who embodied the best values of rural community life. Sandra would be so proud, he said, raising his glass. She always believed that this ranch would be a place of healing and hope. She never got to see her granddaughter grow up, but she knew in her heart that love and legacy would eventually triumph over greed and manipulation. The toast was met with enthusiastic applause and more than a few tears. These people had watched me transform from a lost young woman into someone who contributed meaningfully to their community, and they had played a crucial role in that transformation. Sarah and I honeymooned in Europe, visiting farms and agricultural communities that gave us ideas for expanding our own operation. We came home inspired and energized, ready to begin the next chapter of our life together on the ranch that had become the center of our world. Over the next 2 years, we implemented several new projects that honored Sandra's legacy while building toward our own future. We converted part of the barn into a farm-to-table restaurant that showcased local products and provided employment for young people in the community. We expanded the organic vegetable operation and began hosting educational workshops for urban visitors who wanted to learn about sustainable agriculture. Most meaningfully, we opened our home to foster children who needed temporary placement in a rural setting. Working with the state agency, we provided a safe haven for teenagers who were struggling in traditional foster homes, giving them the chance to experience the healing power of agricultural work and community connection. The first young person we fostered was a 16-year-old girl named Maria, who reminded me painfully of myself at that age. She was angry, defensive, and convinced that no one could be trusted. But gradually, through daily work with the animals and plants, through patient conversations on the front porch, through inclusion in family meals and community events, she began to open up. Watching Maria's transformation was like seeing my own journey reflected back to me. She discovered talents she didn't know she possessed, formed relationships that gave her hope for the future, and began to believe that she deserved love and stability. When she aged out of the system 2 years later, she chose to stay in Cedar Falls and attend the local community college, supported by Sandra's scholarship fund. The ranch had become what Sandra always intended it to be, a place where broken things could be mended and lost souls could find their way home. The land that Eric had seen only as a commodity to be sold had become a source of healing and hope for multiple generations. Sarah and I also began planning for children of our own, excited about the prospect of raising the next generation of the young family on the same land where my father and grandmother had grown up. The nursery we prepared in the upstairs bedroom would overlook the same fields and pastures that had shaped my ancestors, continuing the cycle of love and legacy that Sandra had fought so hard to preserve. But even as we looked toward the future, we never forgot the lessons of the past. Every major decision we made was filtered through the question of what Sandra would have wanted, how our choices would honor her memory and serve the community she had loved. The legal documents establishing our various charitable programs and community initiatives were carefully drafted to prevent the kind of manipulation Eric had attempted. We worked with Brandon Edwards to create ironclad protections that would ensure our work would continue even if something happened to us. Now, 7 years after that first bus ride to Cedar Falls, I wake up every morning in the bedroom where my grandmother kept my school pictures, surrounded by the love and legacy she preserved for me despite every obstacle Eric placed in her way. The ranch that was nearly stolen from me has become the foundation for a life I couldn't have imagined when I was shuffling between foster homes and group facilities. The scared 18-year-old who once believed she was completely alone in the world has been replaced by a confident woman who understands the true meaning of family and community. The inheritance I fought so hard to claim has become a platform for helping others find their own paths from abandonment to belonging. Sarah and I are expecting our first child, a daughter we plan to name Sandra, in honor of the grandmother who made all of this possible. She will grow up knowing her family history, understanding the sacrifices that preserve this land for her, and learning the values of service and community that have defined the Young Ranch for 4 generations. Sometimes I think about what my life would have been like if Eric had succeeded in his fraud, if I had accepted his $50,000 offer and walked away from my inheritance. I would have missed not just the property and financial security, but the deep sense of purpose and belonging that has defined these past 7 years. The community that embraced me as Sandra's granddaughter has become my chosen family in the truest sense. Christina, Timothy, Joshua, and dozens of other neighbors have filled the parental and sibling roles that were empty for so long. Their love and support have been more valuable than any amount of money Eric could have offered. But perhaps most importantly, I've learned that family isn't just about blood relationships or legal documents. It's about the people who show up for you, who believe in your potential, who help you become the person you're meant to be. Sandra did that for me from a distance, and the people of Cedar Falls have continued her work in person. The ranch that Eric tried to steal has become a symbol of hope for young people who are aging out of foster care, proof that it's possible to build meaningful connections and lasting security even when you start with nothing. The scholarship fund, the foster program, the educational workshops, all of it represents Sandra's belief that love and opportunity can triumph over abandonment and neglect. As I prepare to welcome my daughter into this world, I think about the letters Sandra wrote but never sent, the love she carried but couldn't express, the dreams she held but couldn't fulfill. This baby will grow up knowing she is wanted and cherished, surrounded by family and community, rooted in traditions that stretch back 4 generations. She will also grow up knowing the story of how this legacy was nearly lost, how greed and manipulation almost destroyed what love and determination had built. But she'll understand that the real victory wasn't in the courtroom or the legal documents. It was in the choice to honor Sandra's memory by building something lasting and meaningful. I want to hear from all of you who are watching this story, whether you're in foster care, aging out of the system, dealing with family conflicts, or just searching for where you belong. Know that your story isn't over. Sometimes the family we're meant to have isn't the one we're born into, but the one we choose and the one that chooses us. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what this story means to you. Share your own experiences with finding belonging, overcoming obstacles, or discovering unexpected gifts. Your stories matter, and they might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with others who might need to hear that they're not alone, that there's always hope for a better future, and that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin when we least expect them. The ranch that was almost stolen from me has become the foundation for everything I value most in this world. Love really does triumph over greed. Community really can heal the deepest wounds. And sometimes the inheritance that matters most isn't money or a property, but the knowledge that we are loved and that we belong somewhere in this world.